you so much for coming along this afternoon. My name's Aiden Scott. I'm Head of Humanities at Cirencester College. I've been working here for about 16 years or so, and I just thought I put these events on, the remembrance commemorations. Put these events on. The idea was a few years ago, about 6 years ago, was it, something like that. We didn't really do anything for remembrance. You know, I think we had a bell for the minute silence on the 11th, and I just thought, you know, it's a shame we don't really sort of do as much as I felt as we should do. Obviously, we're a whole new generation of people coming through, a generation of people who possibly haven't had any experience of warfare. Even the last wars that we've been involved with in Afghanistan, Iraq, might not be sort of relevant to yourselves. But it is important to remember the people who sacrificed themselves in a host of different ways, not just those people who died, the ultimate sacrifice, but for those people who've had wounds, physical wounds, but mental wounds as well. And as I've said to many of you over the last couple of weeks when I've been trying to push the lecture, we take for granted completely, in some respects, our free and fair society. I say to some of the students that we live in paradise, and I absolutely mean that. More than any other culture or civilization in history, we probably have the most progressive, the most liberal, the most fair society that's ever existed. So all of the people that have ever existed in the whole of history, you are living in a golden period. You're living in a golden period because of people's sacrifices in the past. That price, the freedom that we enjoy, the freedom that we sometimes take for granted, does not come cheap. Alright, so today we're going to look at 1918 in particular, but I'm also going to put the whole of the First World War, hopefully in some sort of context, especially in Year 9. I use Year 9? Especially in Year 9, I've taught Year 9 before, taught GCSE history before. Very often you have that question, who was responsible for the First World War? Was it the Allied system? Was it the arms race? Well, hopefully I should be able to tell you exactly who was responsible for the First World War today. Alright, so you can just write that in your essays if you get the essays there, yeah? I also want to try and look at some of the myths that we have around the the way that the war was fought, especially on the British side. The British are probably the most self-deprecating people in the world. We love knocking ourselves, we love taking the mick out of ourselves, and sometimes that's great, that's brilliant, that gets you through some really hard times, but sometimes it's just simply unfair. Alright, so hopefully I'm going to dispel some of the myths around the First World War as well. And also, right at the end, we're just going to have a quick look at the legacy, some bad, some good, the legacy of the First World War. Okay? Right, and I thought I'd just show you a few minutes worth of what is really our stereotypical image of a general in the First World War. Have you ever seen Blackadder? So Blackadder, yeah, Blackadder goes forth. Everybody knows this general. Go on, who said that? Melchett, yeah? Yeah. General Melchett, right, so let's have a quick look at this.
Now, Field Marshal Hay has formulated a brilliant new tactical plan to ensure final victories in the field.
Will this brilliant plan involve us climbing up our trenches and walking very slowly towards the enemy? How could you possibly know that, Blackadder? It's classified information. It's the same plan that we used last time, and the 17 times before that.
Exactly! And that is what is so brilliant about it. It will catch the watchful hound totally off guard. Doing precisely what we've done 18 times before is exactly the last thing they'll expect us to do this time. There is, however, one small problem.
That everyone always gets slaughtered in the first 10 seconds.
That's right. And Field Marshal Hay is worried that this may be depressing the men attacked. He's looking to find a way to cheer them up.
Well, his resignation and suicide would seem the only.
Interesting thought. Make a note of it, darling. The healthy humour of the honest Tommy. Don't worry, my boy. If you should falter, remember that Captain Darling and I are behind you.
About 35 miles.
Well, you know what this means?
If it's true, sir, we'll have to cancel the push.
Exactly.
What a nuisance.
Exactly what the enemy would expect us to do, and therefore exactly what we shan't do.
Now,
If we attack where the line is strongest, then Fritz will think that our reconnaissance is a total shambles. This will now lead into a sense of full security, and then next week we can attack where the line is actually badly defended, and win the greatest victory since the Winchester flower arranging team beat Harrow by 12 sore bottoms to 1. Eddie, now is my back. Come on, sir. Thank you. God, it's a barren, featureless desert out there.
the other side.
Of course I am. Now let's talk about something more jolly, shall we? Look, this is the amount of land we captured since yesterday.
Well, excellent.
What is the actual scale of this map, darling?
1 to 1, sir.
Down again.
The map is actually life-size, sir. It's superbly detailed, but it's a little worm.
So the actual amount of land we taken is?
Excuse me. 17 square feet, sir.
So you see, young Blackadder didn't die horribly in vain after all.
A German spy is giving away every one of our battle plans.
You look surprised, Blackadder.
I certainly am, sir. I didn't realise we had any battle plans.
Of course we have. How else do you think the battles are directed?
Our battles are directed, sir.
You can all say our Blackadder directed according to the grand plan.
Would that be the plan, to continue the total slaughter until everyone's dead except Field Marshal Haig, Lady Haig, and their tortoise, Alan?
Even you know it! Brought all the doors, hammer large pieces of cooking wood against all the windows. This security leak is far worse than we imagined.
I was wondering whether, having been tortured by the most vicious sadists of the German army, I might be allowed a week's leave to recuperate, sir.
Excellent idea. Your commanding officer would have to be stark raving mad to refuse you.
Well, you are my commanding officer.
Yeah, no, that's grand, that's grand. I think we get the picture. Great, great. So, I think we get the picture. That's the popular stereotypical British generals in the First World War. People who are living in the 19th century who are, have no idea about how to carry out this type of warfare, who don't care about the men, who just send the men aimlessly to slaughter. All right? A few more myths about the First World War, possibly. These are open to question and debate. Obviously, that's what history is about, but, you know, this is a perspective, if you like. It wasn't Germany's fault. So, again, we talk about line system, and arms race, what have you. All the generals were donkeys. It was easy to get shot for deserting. It's a classic one. There's a whole episode in Blackadder about him getting shot for desertion, as though it was an everyday event. So soldiers didn't know what they were fighting for. I heard there was a programme, Chris Evans, in the morning, Radio 2, and he actually said it's such a shame they died for no reason and for something they didn't understand. They didn't understand why they were dying, which is a dreadful, dreadful thing to say. And what a disgraceful thing to say, really, in my opinion. A patronising thing for those men. It was horrible for the men in the trenches. Well, I'm sure some parts of it were, but I'm sure, I can guarantee you, there would be some fantastic times in those trenches as well. As anybody who's been in the forces can tell you, when the going really gets tough, that's when you really start seeing the characters coming out of it, and that's when you see the lads being absolutely brilliant, you know. We only won because of the Americans. The Americans saved the day. All right, we'll dispel that myth quite quickly. And it was all a senseless waste as well. We sort of get superseded by the Second World War. We obviously can see the baddies in the Second World War. The Nazis are classic baddies. We can sort of, you know, point to them, that's brilliant, but the First World War, somehow the Germans weren't as bad as the Germans in the Second World War. It's a very mixed picture in the First World War. A mixed picture in the First World War, so we'll try and have a look at that. Okay. Now, GCSE history, that's where I've taught the First World War most, you know, that's where I've looked at the First World War in most of the teaching that I've done with GCSE. We talk about the democratic systems in Germany. Now, I just want to dispel that myth, really. Some of the German states were democratic, very, very progressive, and what we would consider liberal, some of the most liberal states in the world. So votes for women very often gets dragged up in this discussion about the First World War. But Germany was made up of 4 different kingdoms in 1914 and many duchies. So it was a brand new country. It had only been sort of unified in 1871, like many of the countries in Europe. So it was a brand new country, lots of different duchies, lots of different kingdoms with their own traditions, with their own histories. However, Prussia was by far and away the dominant force in the German Empire. Okay? The king of Prussia was the Emperor of Germany, of the German Empire, from 1871. He was proclaimed Emperor of Germany in the Palace of Versailles after the defeat of the French in 1871. The senior politician for the German Empire. So is everybody all right with that? We've got lots of different states in Germany. We've got one German Empire. The king of Prussia is the Emperor of Germany. The Chancellor is the Imperial Chancellor. He is the Imperial Chancellor appointed by the Emperor. We have an absolutely autocratic state of being in Germany in 1914 for the vast majority of foreign policy, defence, and the declaration of war, making a peace as well, but the declaration of war. Anything to do with the military, anything to do with war, anything to do with foreign policy is directed absolutely and totally by the Emperor. Now that's a dangerous state of affairs for any, it's a lot of responsibility for one person, certainly. Okay, so it's not a democracy. Some of the elements, some of the domestic elements were democratic, as I say. Foreign policy, war was absolutely in the hands of the Emperor. Right, okay, so who was this Emperor? Kaiser Wilhelm II. Very nationalistic in himself. He was young, he was only 29 when he came to power. I'll talk about that in a second. Expansionist policy. He wanted Germany to be great. It was his. Just think about how much power he had in his hands. He wanted Germany to be great. He absolutely controlled foreign policy and was accountable to no one. Now he did have a few issues. Now you've got one person. For the ancient historians, we'll be looking at this very carefully when we do the Julio-Augustan emperors, when we see the effects of one person with autocratic power. Right? But he's got a few issues. First of all, he was born with a withered left arm. Now obviously in today's world that's not a problem. People can just crack on. We see people with disabilities all the time. It's not a problem. In 1914, 1888, it was a problem. You'd be immensely self-conscious about this. He never wears anything but military uniform. He is not a soldier. He is disabled. He is not a soldier. But he never wears anything but military uniform. His father died when he was 29. His mother was English. She used British doctors to treat his father. He adored his father. So there's a whole sort of psychological profile that you could easily make about the Kaiser, above and beyond this person who has autocratic, ultimate power with one of the most advanced militaries in the world. It's quite a dangerous combination to have there. These are some of the quotes. I'll just put them up and let you read some of them. These are quotes by the Kaiser. Only one person who's master in this empire. Shoot down, behead, and eliminate The socialists first, if need be, by a bloodbath, then war abroad. This is advice to his cousin, the Tsar, in Russia. Where my gods appear, there is no room for democracy. And these two really get me, these two at the end here. These were quotes in the spring of 1918, when the Germans had the British and the French forces on the Western Front at their mercy. The spring offensive, I'll talk about this later on in the lecture, but the British and the French looked as though they were nearly defeated in 1918, right 6 months before the end of the war. The Germans threw everything at the British and the French on the Western Front. The battle is won, the English have been utterly defeated. This is not long before the Battle of Amiens, the counter-attack, which I'll talk about later on. If a British parliamentarian comes to sue for peace, he must first kneel before the imperial standard, for this is a victory of monarchy over democracy. Does that sound like a Democrat to you? Does that sound like a liberal, progressive Democrat to you? No, it doesn't. It could, if you put those words in the mouth of Hitler, nobody would be surprised at all. Okay? So, a new Germany. Some of the huge corporations that we still see today. Mercedes-Benz, have you heard of Mercedes-Benz? Huge corporation. Huge industrial complex even in 1918, 1900. The military industrial complex. There's lots of work done on the Second World War to discuss the push from the military industrial complex for the Nazis to create a war, to produce more goods, to develop the economy. It sounds crazy to us, but it's actually a matter of fact. I think it's accepted by historians now in the Second World War, but we've got the same pushes, the same influences in the First World War as well. The German Navy as well. This is an important one. This is one that's always brought up in terms of the arms race. We talk about the British and the Germans building battleships, or the British build battleships and the Germans build battleships and the British build... Why are the Germans building battleships? Why do the Germans need to build battleships? I wasn't asking questions really, but go on.
Because Kaiser was extremely jealous of the British Navy. He was actually part of the British Navy before it wasn't. Because he marched down and everyone made fun of him for marching down to Sabra. But yeah, he was jealous of the British Navy, so he decided to...
Fantastic, excellent. Round of applause, round of applause. Come on. It sounds ridiculous. It sounds absolutely ridiculous. But it's about kudos. It's about that prestige. You know, he sees himself as the leader of this resurgent, this brand new German nation. It's a nationalist ideal. He wants to make Germany the greatest nation in the world. He wants to build up the naval forces so he can spread the influence of Germany. Britain, obviously we've got the empire, but we've also had 100 years of peace since the end of the Napoleonic Wars. 100 years of peace, barring the Crimea and the Boer War. These are small-scale wars in relation to what went on before and what comes after. So the British Navy, really, the Royal Navy, were almost like the police of the seas, if you like. They abolished slavery single-handedly. Not many people sort of appreciate the fact that the Royal Navy pretty much single-handedly abolished slavery across the globe. Okay, so the idea that he wants confrontation with Britain is quite unusual, because before this time, Germany and Britain had been very close allies. Okay, Russia, he antagonises Russia as well, almost purposely, really. We have growing influence from the Austrians in the Balkans, so Serbia and places like that, Bosnia, growing influence from the Austrians, and they're being pushed all the time. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is basically, pardon me, like a vassal state to Germany, really, at the start of the 1900s. All right, so anything the Austrians are doing, they're being pushed to do it by the Germans. France, Alsace-Lorraine, huge areas, the most industrial areas of France, have been annexed by the Germans following the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. So there's lots of French people living as part of the German Empire anyway. That's obviously going to be an issue there. German war aims. Now, just look at some of those war aims there. If this was 1939, nobody would be surprised here. All right? These are the actual German warrior. I've tried to summarise them as much as possible. The Schlieffen Plan. This is, it's called the Schlieffen Plan, a holistic sort of name for it. Really, there's about 4 or 5 different plans. They pretty much all go through Belgium. Belgium has a neutrality that has been guaranteed from the Treaty of London in 1839, when the British primarily, but also the French and the Germans, the German states, the Prussians, guaranteed independence of small states in Europe. Right, so the guarantee of small states. The Belgians actually fought for their independence. Catholic Belgians fought for independence against the Protestant Dutch Empire following the Napoleonic Wars. And they were successful in that war of independence, and the British primarily guaranteed their neutrality. Right? The Schlieffen Plan, the German plans, just disregard absolutely the neutrality and the nation statehood of Belgium. It's not just a piece of paper, it's not just an excuse. All right? It was absolutely set in stone. Also, those Belgian ports would be taken over by the German Navy. Right? They're right directly opposite Britain here. Push back the Russian border. Their idea was to push back the Russian border. Global domination with a blue water navy. That means an ocean-going navy. There's only one navy they're going to be competing with in that case, and that's going to be the Royal Navy. Weaken France forever. This is a war aim of the Germans in 1940. Become the centre of a Middle European economic bloc. Thank goodness they never fulfilled that ambition. A bit of irony there. They've already got most of the French iron ore fields, but taking all the French and Belgian iron ore fields, and British trade would be excluded from Europe. Now, if you think I'm making this up, this is a map of, when you look at this, I don't know about you, but when you look at this, you think, holy Moses, this is unbelievable. This is in the 1st of June, 1918. 1918. These are the German-occupied areas on the 1st of June 1918. This is how close the Germans came to winning the First World War. They were that close to winning the First World War. And the world would be a completely different place if they'd been successful. Never mind the Second World War, it would have been completely different if they'd won the First World War. This is, by the way, just as on a personal point of view, for those of you doing the Memorial War, the sort of memories of your relatives who've been in conflict. My great uncle, who I'm going to put up on the wall, was killed 3 days before this map, before the date of this map. He was killed just about there at Soissons, on one of the final big pushes of the Germans. They tried to break the British lines generally, tried to break the British lines, tried to break the toughest nut in 1918, which were the British lines. And they didn't succeed. Thank goodness. But look at this. This is straight after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Everybody know the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk? Excellent. We compare it with the Treaty of Versailles sometimes. Well, the Treaty of Versailles was terrible, wasn't it? The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The communists, when the communists came to power, they tried to guarantee a peace and weren't happy with the German demands. And they said, no, we're not doing that. Lenin said, no, we're not happy with that. Trotsky, not happy with that. So the Germans said, all right, and they just kept on going, and kept on going, and kept on going, until the communist regime in the Soviet Union, as it became, met those demands. They had absolutely no choice about it. Look at how far east they go. I mean, this is not far short of the furthest extent of German forces in 1942. Okay? This is the situation in 1918. It's unbelievable. So, Britain's response to German aggression. Retain the two-power standard. That's what Britain wanted to do. Britain's policy was, because it had a global empire, it was protecting those trade routes across the empire, across the dominions, across the empire. So that was the primary function of Britain's armed forces, was to protect not just Britain's trade routes, by the way, but the whole world's trade routes. It's a bit like the conflict that's going on in the South China Sea at the moment with the Americans and the British confronting Chinese vessels. The Chinese are pushing and expanding in the South China Sea. We're trying to sort of inhibit that and confront them quite aggressively in some cases to say, no, this is free. This is a free area. Anybody can come there. It doesn't belong to you. All right? Protect the dominions and the empire. Britain did not want to go to war. We have a tiny army in 1914. I'll talk about the sizes in a second. We did not want to go to war in 1914. It was the last thing we wanted. We tried in the same way as we did in 1939. We tried everything to stop this conflict from breaking out. However, it was soon realised that if we didn't get in, it would be much worse if the Germans dominated the whole of Europe. It would be far, far worse for British prospects and for world prospects, really, if that was the case. Lots being said about the alliance system. The British did not have a defensive alliance with either the French or the Russians. There's no formal alliance there. There's an entente. All right, it's just a sort of a friendly agreement as such. All right, so this idea that there's an alliance system there that's just like everything's for the British are looking after their own interests, really. They're not sort of doing an altruistic sort of aspect there for the French or the Russians. The French, they don't really get on with in 1914, really, or the Russians, really. However, the scrap of paper was an absolute necessity in British foreign policy in 1914, and that neutrality of Belgium was core to the reasons for it's sometimes undermined with the sort of cynical sort of discussion about the reasons behind the war. And that was the foreign Edward Grey, who was the foreign secretary. This is what he said just on the eve of war. Just on the eve of war. The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime. That does not sound like a warmonger to me, by the way. Right, so, the British Army. So what we're going to do, the British Army gets in there, we declare war on Germany, and that's going to solve all our problems. But it's not at all. The British Army is tiny in 1914. It's basically a global police force, an imperial police force. It sorts out little disputes all over the globe, really. It is not a massive standing army in the way that the continental powers like Germany, France and Russia have huge armies, yeah? However, it is all professional. I mean, we're talking about the Persian Wars with the ancient historians there. The difference between soldiers going into battle with the whip behind them, and people fighting because they want to fight and they think it's the right thing to do. All of the European powers, all of the continental European powers, are conscript armies. Do you understand that? Yeah, conscripts. So therefore, you've got to. You have to take your place in the armed forces. Horses, most forces in 1914 relied on horses. Artillery control. So artillery is quite a difficult thing to get right. What you're doing, you're sending a projectile through basically a tube. You're pointing it in the right direction. So the enemy's over there, so you want to point it in that direction. And it's about the, what's the word I'm looking for? Eh? Yeah. The angle of the do. The angle of the do, it's not the word. The angle of the projectile, that the projectile is going to be fired out of the cannon. Yeah? And the projectile gets sent over. The higher the angle is up to a point, the further it's going to go. Yeah? It's very difficult to get that right. And really the British were all right at it, but everybody had problems with that. So it's not very accurate. That's an RAF plane or a military plane in 1914. Honestly, sort of basically bits of wood and paper and line it, you know, very, very flimsy aircraft at the beginning of the First World War. So much smaller. It was strictly forbidden for the British forces to practice fighting against the Germans. So when I was a young soldier in 1989, seems like a long time ago, all we did and John will back us up here, all we practiced against was the Russians. Everything, all the Russian planes, Russian tanks, that was it. We were just getting ready to fight the Russians, so that was good fun. Yeah. So it was against, we couldn't practice against the Germans, yeah, because we had no sort of formal disagreement with them. But there was no coordination before 1914 with either the French or the Belgians. None at all, because we were isolationist. We didn't want to get involved with the continent. However, we had probably the best trained and the best equipped army out of the whole lot of them. And it's the British Expeditionary Force, people again fail to remember this, was probably one of the best armies we've ever sent abroad. In the context of its time, it was probably one of the best armies, the most professional armies. A large reason for that was it 13 years hence, we had just come out of the Boer War. And the Boers were, whatever their faults, they were excellent soldiers. They were brilliant soldiers, all right? And they were frontiersmen, they were hard as nails, and they were excellent marksmen, and they made life terrible for the red-coated soldiers who were walking around South Africa trying to chase these Boers who would just disappear into the bush. Right? So the Boers learned us, that's a Geordie expression, taught us a really, really good lesson in warfare. So, you know, you always learn much more from a defeat than a victory. So, the start of hostilities in 1914 on the Western Front. The British sent 4 infantry divisions. A division is around between 10 and 20,000 men. 10 and 20,000 men. So the British sent 4 infantry divisions and 1 cavalry division. Cavalry on the horses, yeah? All right? Everybody all right with that? The Germans, that's the old German flag then, the imperial flag of Germany, had 100 infantry divisions. Can you see the distinction here? So quite overwhelmingly sort of superior forces, the Germans here. All right? So we're going to have a tiny impact really in 1940. Our ally, the French, had 62 infantry divisions and 10 cavalry divisions. Okay? There's a distinction here, however. They are conscript soldiers. They're all conscript soldiers. Right? The British are a professional army. And that professional army is retained throughout the whole war. I'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but that professionalism is maintained all through the First World War and is still a case in point today. We still have a small but very effective, probably the best army in the world, a very effective professional armed forces, phenomenal armed forces that we should be all proud of. Yeah? So, for the next 3 or 4 years, the British are going to be the junior partners under French overall command. Let me just take that on board there. So think about the stereotypes that we have. The French are running the Western Front for the next 3 years, up until 1918 basically. The vast majority of troops on the Western Front are French. And this is, I've got some nice images of the lads. This is a state of warfare in 1914. The state of warfare in 1914. The lads there, they haven't got steel helmets. No steel helmets. Nobody's got steel helmets in 1914. So steel helmets are there to protect you from shrapnel and gunfire and what have you. No steel helmets. Very, very heavy machine guns. These guns weigh 60 pounds. 60 pounds, about 30 kilos. You would struggle, all of you would struggle to pick one of these weapons up. What that means is they're not very manoeuvrable. You can't really run with them and put them down. A heavy machine gun today weighs about 20 pounds, yeah? However, we did have this phenomenal weapon, the Lee Enfield 303. Fantastic weapon which was developed on the back of the hammering we got in the Boer War at the start of the century. It had a rifle barrel. It was very effective, up to around about 500 yards, about 500 meters, and it could fire at a rate of around about 20 rounds a minute, about 20 bullets a minute. And what you would do is the cocking handle there, can you see this cocking handle up here? You would pull this back and it would, as you pushed it forward, another round would be pushed up, another bullet would be pushed up, and it would be housed into the breech, yeah? 5 rounds in the magazine, which isn't very many by today's standards, but very, very accurate, and in the right hands, absolutely deadly. By the way, we're talking about the war here, and I will be talking about killing people and the effectiveness of machines for killing people, because that's what war's about. It's about killing the enemy before you can be killed yourself, and doing it as effectively as you possibly can. Okay? So, the British forces, in the first few months, first couple of weeks even, 2 battles which stand out in 1914. I'm just going through this to give you an indication of where we are in 1914. We have no tanks, we've got no aircraft, we haven't even got helmets, we've got no grenades, we've hardly got any machine guns that you can pick up and carry forwards. We have lightly armed troops with rifles in the case, really good rifles in the case of the British, and that is it really. I mean, however, it can be deadly, it can be mega effective in the right hands, as the British showed in the Battle of Mons, when the German Schlieffen Plan came round into Belgium. We managed to halt the Germans, at Nîmes Bridge. I don't know if anybody's heard of that. Nîmes Bridge, awesome action by the Royal Fusiliers. And they were picking off the Germans from 1,000 yards, nearly a kilometre. They were picking off the Germans before they got to the bridge. They were trying to take the bridge, and the British rate of fire was so great, using those rifles, that the Germans thought they had machine guns. And it was all about accuracy. It was all about the accuracy of the shot. Awesome, really, awesome. It managed to halt the Germans just enough so that the French could get in there and support and re-support the defence, really. This is an image of Belgian soldiers. I mean, this looks like it's from the 17th century or something. Does anybody know what's going on here? Anybody guess what's going on here? Yeah, go on. Dogs pulling carts, absolutely. Any ideas what's on the carts? Go on. No, it's not. Good guess, good guess. I don't think even these big dogs would be able to pull out. Go on. Machine guns. Good effort. Excellent. Machine guns. They've got machine guns. The dogs carrying machine guns. Right? So, I mean, look at these forces. These are the first Cameronians, the Highlanders. The Highlanders, I don't know if anybody's got any Highland blood in you. Highlanders been at the vanguard of pretty much every British action for the last 200 odd years, yeah? But look at their kit, mega lightly armoured, only got rifles, that's all they've got. This Battle of the Marne, again, the Battle of the Marne was another holding operation where the British managed to sort of be very influential in holding the Germans back. But look at their kit, it's like 19th century stuff really. The Germans the same. The Pickelhaube, these are the helmets there, the stereotypical sort of German. I mean, this is 19th century stuff. These are felt helmets, they're not steel helmets. They're just leather, basically, with felt on them. Really sort of antiquated when we look at them today. And the French are even worse. The French have these huge big blue overcoats and bright red pants. I mean, you're talking about Napoleonic stuff here. It is just, I mean, this looks like Civil War. It looks like the American Civil War for those of you who studied the American Civil War. And that's exactly as it should, because they're exactly the same troops using exactly the same tactics as the American Civil War. 50 years prior to this. So, 1914, what we have is a situation where the two sides, these show the dates, 18th of September, 17th of September, 18th, 22nd, 24th, 27th, 30th. These are attacks by the two different forces. We've got the red, the Germans, and the French and British in the blue. And what we have is what's called the race to the sea, where the two armies, the two different armies, try and outflank each other over and over again until they reach the Channel of Ports. And then we have stalemate. Stalemate for 3 years. 3 years on the Western Front, where we have the trench systems being built, defensive positions being made, very, very powerful, very, very strong defensive positions, and we have this stalemate for 3 years. Now, we're not going to talk about every single battle, that's not the point of the lecture. What I am going to talk about is one in particular, and that's the Somme. Well, we're going to talk about two. But I'll just have an interlude and look at the Somme. All right? I know I'm talking about 1918 later. But the Somme is the one that captures our imagination. The Somme, if I was to ask you what was the most famous battle in the First World War, what do you know about the First World War, most of you would say, oh, the Battle of the Somme was terrible. Largest casualty rate ever in the history of the British forces, the British forces. And it was absolutely horrendous. The first day of the Somme, in July 1916, 20,000, around about 20,000 British deaths. 20,000. Okay? I mean, that is just horrendous, absolutely horrific. You can't even imagine the scale of suffering. Okay? However, we've got to see this in context of what's going on. This is pretty much sort of widespread across the front. So every action that the Germans are doing, the French are doing, the attack on Verdun, the similar sort of casualties. Now what we have here are an enormous set of preparations. The British knew this. Haig, the commander of the British forces, knew the problems, absolutely understood the problems and appreciate the problems. And what you see is not just a mindless and senseless waste of life. There are plans in place here to try and produce a victory, to try and knock the Germans out of the war. They're trying to finish the war as quickly as possible. And what we see are a series of plans put in place which are unprecedented really. In 5 days, there were 1.7 million shells fired at the Germans. 1.7 million shells fired at the German positions. And what they wanted to do, they wanted to break the barbed wire all along the front. There was rows and rows of barbed wire, sometimes about 40, 50 meters thick. Now obviously if you're advancing towards that barbed wire, you're going to get stuck in that barbed wire and you're going to be picked off by the machine gun posts which are in the opposing trenches. They wanted to cut the barbed wire, so they realised that was a major issue. They wanted to sap the morale of the German forces. Constant bombardment, day and night. And they wanted to destroy the strong points. Now, these obviously didn't work. The plans didn't work. But they used new ideas. They were coming up with new ideas. That's the point. They're not just doing the same thing as the previous 17 times as Blackadder mentioned there. This is completely new. It's a transformation in the type of warfare to try and break that stalemate, that deadlock. Look at this, these are empty shell cases. I mean, this is just extraordinary in modern warfare terms, yeah? This image here, this is on the Somme. This is a still image of the shells that were being fired during that assault. 5 days, 5 days of... That's when the Somme starts. 5 days hence to the first... We always say the first day of the Somme. The Battle of Somme started 5 days previous. Heavy artillery. Heavy artillery that wasn't as accurate as it was going to be later on. And I'll talk about that further on in the lecture. And mines. Absolutely huge mines exploded. 400 tons of explosives. Quarried away. Literally, miners going in, miners from Wales and Northumberland, Geordie miners and Welsh miners going in there, Scottish miners going in there and digging these huge tunnels under the German positions. The British were phenomenal at it, absolutely brilliant at it. There was hundreds, if not thousands of miles of tunnels all along the Western Front. And they would build these huge caverns right under the German positions, and 2 minutes to go before the British forces went over the top, they blew these mines up. And I think it was 19 on the first couple of minutes of the advance into German territory. The loudest explosions, man-made explosions, up until the atomic weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They heard them in London. 400 mile away, 500 mile. Immense. And they're trying this. Whether they're successful or not, it doesn't make any difference. They're trying new tactics. Right. And then the infantry advance. And this idea that you get up and you walk across, it sounds absolutely ludicrous to us. As a modern soldier, you would think that's insane. That's a crazy thing to do. And it sort of is, really. But the idea behind it was absolutely logical. The artillery wasn't as accurate as it was going to be. We had what was called a creeping barrage. So the artillery would open up onto the German lines, and then as the Allies went forward, the artillery would cease, and the artillery would hit positions behind the German front line. So it would sort of creep forward in front of the infantry. That's a really tricky thing to do, especially when you have no radios. There's no communications between the lads at the front and the people who are directing things at the back. That is a nightmare. So as soon as that starts, that offensive starts, you've lost control. So those generals were doing their best with the worst materials that they could have in terms of the logistics and the communications. It was a nightmare. And it really sort of irritates me sometimes when you hear offhand comments about, oh, they're all idiots, they're all donkeys. Well, I would like to see, people work as well. With saying that, we have horrendous casualties. This is an image, a famous image of the Tyneside Irish, Geordies of Irish descent, going forward on the first day of the song. 80% casualties. 80% casualties. Some of the heaviest casualties of the war there. So most of those lads wouldn't have got through that day. It's a horrific sort of thought, really. They were heavily laden. They had their whole kit. They had about 70, 80 pounds on. They had all of their ammunition because they thought they were going to break through. They thought the German lines would be broken. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. The Germans had deeper defences. They managed to get up there for their lives, running for their lives, get onto their machine posts and fire up those machine guns onto the advancing British soldiers and causing devastating losses, really. However, some points were taken. This is a famous image of the British Tommies. Awesome picture, awesome photograph of British Tommies in a German trench. You can see there. Anybody know how we know it's a German trench? Go on in. Go on in. Yeah. Trying to say it? No, it's a good guess. Anybody else? Go on in. Good. Excellent, yeah, it's really deep one, yeah, the Germans, deep trenches. Next one, last one.
Because the way the Hindenburg line is arranged?
Right, okay, well, possibly. Right, yeah, no, good answer. Yeah, you've got the barbed wire over here, you've also got a fire step here, so you know the sort of cross-section of the trench you've got a fire step here. So he's looking back into the German lines, he's in a German trench, alright? So some positions were taken, some of it was successful. Now let's look at the logistics in 1916. I'll just fly through this quite quickly because I want to get on to 1918. Most units were formed of companies of about 200 men. So they were quite unwieldy, really. Again, in modern terms, it's a large unit of men to try and move around the battlefield. They went forward in waves of 100 yards apart. So imagine that. Tyneside Irish there, going forward, waves, walking, because they were trying to retain their energy as such. They had heavy packs on. And they were also these volunteers. They weren't professional soldiers. So you couldn't train them up to the standard of the professionals who were fighting in 1914. That's okay. No worries. So they're going forward in waves of 100 yards apart. Thanks very much, Henry. ammunition and supplies. This was supposed to be a breakthrough, so they had all the ammunition and supplies. Ammunition weighs horrible amounts of weight. Yeah. Line abreast to maintain structure. The battlefield is one of the noisiest places in the world. You want to see your oppo, your mates, either side of you. You want to retain that momentum going forward. There's logic behind these what appear to be horrific decisions. Again, they expected the 1.7 million shells to have done the job. They also interspersed the regular divisions with the territorial and the new, what were called Kitchener's new divisions. So these people who flocked to join up at the start of hostilities, volunteers up until 1916, they all had to be trained up. A lot of them were PALS battalions. I don't know if you've ever heard of that term before. And that had horrific consequences after the Somme. So PALS battalions, you would get recruiters going into towns or villages or factories, and they would recruit wholesale from different areas, and they would keep them in the same units. The rationale behind that was that they would fight better with their comrades and their friends next to them. Right? Obviously, there's a horrific consequence when many of those units are being pretty much wiped out, like the Tyneside Irish. Yeah? Horrific effects on some of those communities that they came from. Very poor communications, as I mentioned. Poor intelligence as well. The RAF really wasn't up to scratch with it. It didn't exist until 1918 anyway. And probably one of the most important things here is ineffective counter battery artillery strategies. So the enemy artillery, as soon as that infantry would go forward, the enemy artillery had all of those positions mapped out, so they didn't have to worry about accuracy. They knew exactly where those soldiers were. They could fire on those positions. They were pre-set up to fire on those positions. So as soon as the British even got through the first line, the German artillery, the counter-artillery would open up and absolutely trash the British soldiers. And the vast majority of men on the Western Front were killed by artillery. Okay? The French, Haig didn't want to attack in July. He wanted to attack, he wanted to build up more of his forces for the end of August. However, Verdun, maybe would have fallen before then. Verdun was like the linchpin in the French line. If we hadn't attacked at Somme, the French would have fallen. And one of the French generals, I think it was Foch, said to Haig, if you don't attack, you've got nothing left to fight for. And Haig said, all right. And you've got communications going back. I can't attack on the 1st of July because we're not prepared. All right, sent it back. All right, well, don't worry about it. You'll not have anything to fight for anyway. France will be gone. Okay? And Haig sends back, okay, 1st of July it is. And that's the rationale behind it. And dud artillery shells. There's still a sort of a bit of mystery about this. But something like 70% of the shrapnel shells were duds. That's why there's so many unexploded shells on the Western Front today. So they were going over there, and they weren't going off as such. And shrapnel shells, they're not high explosives. What they have, they've got a high explosive core with lots of basically metal, either ball bearings or metal, just casing around the explosive. So when it lands, there's a percussion, and what happens is the explosion, the explosive detonates, and it just spreads that rain of metal, that twisted metal, in a cone of around about sort of 50 yards wide. So that's what you're dying for. You know, you get the impression you're dying from an explosion. People sort of bounce around and all that. It's actually just metal that's been shredded and is travelling at supersonic speeds and is just ripping you to shreds, basically. But the shrapnel shells weren't effective at destroying the barbed wire. Right? So there's mistakes here, absolutely. And the Germans had these Maxims, German version of the Maxim, a machine gun. You can't carry these things, as I say, they're about 60 pounds. You can't carry them forward, really. However, they're brilliant for setting up in positions, for defensive positions. Everything about the technology in 1914, 15, 16, 17 is on the side of the defender. You're trying to carry out offensive operations with very, very strong defences with no tools at all at your disposal. And this is I'm saying a horrific weapon. It's an awesome weapon. 500 rounds a minute. 500 rounds a minute coming out of there. All right, and these are heavy shells as well, and they will do horrific damage. Even if they hit, one of these shells hits you in the arm, it's going to take your arm off. All right, so it's going to kill you even if you get winged. And there's a German machine gun post there on the Somme there. Fantastic soldiers as well, very well disciplined, not maybe as innovative or as independent as some of the regular British troops, but very, very well trained German soldiers. And obviously, iconic image of the Somme there, horrific casualties, horrific casualties in the Somme. Something like 456,000 British casualties, 456,000, because it wasn't just the first day, it went on for months as well, up until I think late October. So that's one of the criticisms of Haig. He kept on pushing and he kept on pushing, even when people were saying, this is futile, this is absolutely futile. Okay? But again, it's very difficult to criticise when they're in command, they've got the big picture. 200,000 French casualties and 434 German casualties. Lots of German military commanders said this broke the back of the German forces. This destroyed the best German soldiers. So again, that's something you've got to take into account there. And you know, I'm not going to apologise for showing dead people on a lecture about war. Horrific casualties. So on the back of that, we have advances in artillery. Battle of Messines in 1917, we start to see real advances. The British are working unbelievably hard to get this right, and it is much more successful in 1917. I've just mentioned this. 1.7 million rounds on the Somme, 3.25 at Messines. The British have learned from their mistakes, absolutely. A much higher proportion of the effort was about destroying the German artillery, not necessarily the soldiers, destroying the counter-artillery. And we'll see this at Amiens in a moment, all right? Right. So, 1918, get to the crux of it. 1918. I just want to put it in the context here, because this is really important. In 1918, after nearly 4 years of war, we have a situation where the Russians capitulate. We've got the Russian Revolution in 1917, the Soviet forces take over in the October Revolution. They make peace as soon as they can with the Germans. 3rd of March 1918. So on the 3rd of March 1918, remember that Eastern Front where they're fighting the Russians, all of those German forces, or pretty much the majority of those German forces, flood into the Western Front. Hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened German troops flooding into that Western Front there. Now on the other side of the coin, we've got the US forces, hundreds of thousands coming in since the middle of 1917, but the US forces are totally ill-prepared for this type of warfare. Again, the American forces are tiny up to 1917. The American forces are tiny. They don't want anything to do with this European war. They don't make an impact until the middle of 1918. All right? So up until that point, the British are actually having to expend resources training the Americans in trench warfare. The first instances of the Germans taking on the Americans, or the Americans taking on the Germans, end horrifically badly for the Americans on every case. All right? The French are absolutely exhausted, to the point where in the southern sector, this sector down here, around Verdun, the French will not go on offensive operations. The French troops refuse to go over the top. They refuse orders over and over again. The French are pretty much exhausted, bled white by Verdun. All right, so over 1 million casualties at Verdun for the French. So ultimately, it's up to the British. It is up to the British in 1918 to absorb what's called the Spring Offensive, which is the German push using all of those resources to try and smash through the British lines, specifically the British lines in the northern part of the line. Because the British were the toughest nut to crack in 1918. So if they could crack the British, they would be able to get through and destroy. The French would capitulate. If the British went, the French would capitulate. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And the Germans knew that, and everybody knew that. So we have a series of tactics. We also have the British. I've never mentioned the Royal Navy. We've had U-boat warfare. Britain is 60% reliant on overseas imports for food. If the U-boats win the war at sea, Britain would starve. It's as simple as that. And that's exactly what the British do to the Germans. The naval blockade starts to really bite in 1918. You see different figures about it. It's very difficult to determine the number of deaths due to starvation in Germany in 1918. Anything from 100,000 to, I've seen figures of 700,000 deaths through starvation, through the British blockade, the Royal Naval blockade of Germany. All right, so that's started by the Germans have to throw everything in the ring, and they do in the Spring Offensive. And it's a phenomenal offensive, really. You know, I've obviously from a professional point of view, you have mega respect for the lads on the front line, whoever's sort of uniform they're in. And these lads are awesome. Stormtroopers, German stormtroopers, absolutely phenomenal troops. Very well trained, almost totally using Prussian troops, so the best troops in the German forces. Hand grenades, loads of hand grenades. And if you ever have anything to do with fighting in built-up areas, you carry bags of grenades. If you're going into a building or in close proximity to the Germans, to the enemy, you have lots of grenades. You're throwing grenades all over the shop. Not all over the shop, that'd be really dangerous, but just where it's needed, you know. Awesome troops. They've got flamethrowers, they've got machine guns, light machine guns that they can take in there. And they're used in such a way that they would punch a hole through the front and then just go into wherever they were basically special forces. Punch through and then create havoc. They were completely independent, totally relying on each other as such to do what they needed to do. Awesome troops. And this looks like, think about those images I showed you of the first year of the war. Look at that chap there, man. He's straight out 1940. All right, so he is a phenomenally trained. They were the best of the best, the special forces of the German troops, and they were extremely, extremely effective. And they nearly got it. They were hair's breadth. And again, it was the British who managed to stop that advance in its tracks through professionalism, through depth of defences, and through just pure determination in some respects. They wouldn't give up, and the Germans overstretched themselves. It petered out, and by June of 1918, the Germans were starting to waver. All right? This is when we get going back to those quotes from the Kaiser. If a British parliamentarian comes to me, you have to kneel in front of the imperial standard. This is on the back of this victory as they saw it. They were within a day's march of Paris. You always say that, don't you? You always say a day's march. How far is Paris? Where is Paris? It must be massive. So, the British hold, the French and the British, obviously, and the imperial troops as well. Just want to mention the imperial troops. I'll mention those a little bit later. But the imperial troops, the whole of the empire is involved here. We talk about the British. What I mean is the British Empire. The whole of the empire is involved here. It's a phenomenal scale, really. We've got about 5 million men under arms here. 5 million men. It's extraordinary. From that tiny military force in 1948, we've got the greatest, possibly one of the greatest armies that's ever existed for its time. It's unbelievable. And Haig and Rawlinson, who were the two commanders at the Somme, so, you know, again, go back to that stereotypical image, they come up with an unprecedented and revolutionary way of committing their forces to the action. It's unbelievable. And this sets the scene for modern warfare. These are the same tactics we're pretty much employing even today. And it's all about combined arms. Now you've got tanks. The tanks first used in the Somme, but very, very unreliable. British invention, the tank. And they can just smash through those barbed wire defences. They can just roll straight over trenches. Awesome. Really, really well developed by the time we get to 1918. We've got aircraft, we've got a whole range of technologies there that are open to the British military forces. Okay, so tanks, we'll just go through the different types of technology that we've got here. Tanks, got two types of tanks, Mark V, which is I'll show you pictures of those in a minute, and Whippet tanks, which are much faster and could race through the gaps made by the heavier tanks, yeah? 414 tanks, including 120 to carry supplies. So again, one of the reasons the Germans failed was they didn't have the supplies to go forward. Didn't have that continuity or the momentum. They couldn't keep up the momentum. So there's the Mark V tanks, phenomenal. By the way, tank, anybody know where the name comes from? Tank, go on, yeah?
It was the way they kept it secret from the Germans.
Excellent, yeah. So they put orders in for a metal, they're supposed to be water tanks. That's where we get the word tank from. Alright, so that's why we call it tanks. Good effort. This is from Amiens. And we've also got artillery, amazing advances in artillery. To be honest, I don't really understand the science because it's physics, right? So I'll just go through it very quickly. Basically, you're triangulating where the counter batteries are from the noise of the shell being fired. So the British had microphones set up on the front, and when a shell was fired, they would pick up the frequency of the shell going off, and they would be able to tell the distance from the frequency and also the angle, the bearing. Phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. If you have three up, you can triangulate on that point. And this is accurate to within 25 to 50 metres. It's unbelievable. So when the German guns go off, they've just committed suicide. Which again, I'm not going to apologise for talking about killing people, because that's what you have to do. In a war, you have to kill as many of the enemy as you possibly can, as quickly and as efficiently as you can. That's what war is about. It's unbelievable. So we've got mega accurate artillery there. We also have the RAF. This is an SE-5, much better aircraft by 1918. Throughout most of the war, the Germans have had air superiority. The Fokkers, it's a type of plane. The German Fokkers were awesome. You know, you've seen three sort of winged aircraft, the SE-5, never hear about the SE-5, but it was the Spitfire really of the First World War. It was a phenomenal aircraft. And in Amiens, it wasn't just used for shooting down the enemy aircraft, it was also used for strafing the enemy with machine gun fire, and also dropping bombs. So ground attack, in exactly the same way as we've used Typhoons today in the RAF. Fantastic innovations. They also had wireless as well, so they could communicate with the ground forces and coordinate things on the ground as well. Phenomenal. And here's an image from Amiens as well, from one of these aircraft. Fantastic, absolutely brilliant. So you've got an eye in the sky, a bit like the drones in Afghanistan or wherever that we have today, yeah? So you can see exactly what the enemy are doing, which is what they need to be able to sort them out. Infantry tactics, think about those lines going forward there. 5 million men under arms in the British Empire. That's just phenomenal, I mean, honestly. Built on the stormtrooper type attacks, they used Australians and Canadians and Scots very often, especially the Australians and the Canadians. They were fitter, they were stronger, and they had a sort of independent spirit. They weren't very well disciplined, the Australians, but they had an independent spirit because they were frontiersmen. They were living in the wilds of Australia and the wilds of Canada. They were hard as nails. you know, a lot of the British soldiers were from like, there's like Liverpool and things. You know, they were sort of like about that tall and sort of, really well. Newcastle as well. Blobs. So blobs are smaller units of highly trained men going forward instead of the lines. So they can support each other going forward. Sections, I suppose, or squads you might want to call them. And they would move forward in a series of rushes using fire and movement, which is just exactly what you would do today. So fire and movement means, say if my oppo's over here, my pal is over here, I'm down, giving covering fire, he moves into cover, he gets into cover, he can give me covering fire, and then I can move and get into cover as well. Alright? So you're just giving covering fire. And you do that on a massive scale. You can expand that right out from 2 men to a whole division. Take immediate objectives and not worry about the strong points. So they would get focused previously on the strong points. They would try and destroy the strong points. If it's a strong point, just go around it. Just ignore it, go around it. Leave that to the bombers, or leave that to the artillery, or leave it to the tanks. So you just ignore the strong points and mop up the battery. And they've got LMGs, light machine guns, grenades, and trench mortars. And the big thing really is combined arms, really. As soon as I'll go through the sequence of events, basically you're neutralising the enemy batteries. There was 2,000 guns neutralised in the first few hours of the Battle of Amiens, which is just unbelievable. I mean, unbelievable. They also cut a deep path through the German trench system using high explosives rather than shrapnel. 1,900 aircraft used in the attack. Again, tactical support and a creeping barrage. What had happened in the past was the artillery was used to have a massive bombardment like the Somme for like 5 or 8 days or whatever it was. Huge bombardment, and then the troops, and then it would stop. So imagine if you were German, massive bombardment for days and days, continuously 24 hours, and then it just stops. What happens then is, you hear the whistles and the lads get out of their trenches and walk across no man's land like so. Alright, the Germans get out of their trenches as quickly as possible, get their machine gun and shoot the lads down. Yeah? That's what's happened in the Somme, for example. Here, what's happening, the first barrage occurs at exactly the same time, as exactly the same time as the infantry go over. So because they're much more accurate, imagine the barrage going in at the same time as the lads are going forward. So they're destroying the infantry position straight away. They've got no forewarning of the British going forward. So they're destroying, and as soon as that line is taken, the heavier guns that are further back from the British line take out the German guns which are opening up in response. Almost immediately. So there's no counter-barrage at Amiens. It's unbelievable. And they're so accurate now with their artillery that you are 50 yards behind the barrage. So there are shells landing in front of you 50 yards. I'm sure John's been in a similar sort of position where you have John's what age, John? King's Own Border. But you do have, on live firing exercises, you do have shells coming down in front of you. A bit scary when you've got reserve American Air Force pilots sending sort of 500-pounders in front of you. It can be quite scary, really. Unbelievable. Look at the image. Look at the difference from 1914. This is a professional, even though it's by 1916 we have to enforce conscription. We have to enforce conscription, which is amazing, really, that we have such a professional army in 1918. Half of the troops are conscripts. A quarter, not even a quarter, I would say, I would probably say about 1/7 of the troops are regular troops or territorial troops. The other percentage there are the new volunteer armies that have survived the Somme. All right, but still by 1918 they are absolutely unbelievable. And look at this. This is a modern army, no doubt at all about that. Surprise as well. Amiens, the civilians were removed from the area. conferences. The high command, the conferences were moved around in secret. They were peppered all across the front. So they were planning an attack over here, and they'd be down by Verdun or wherever. Just to keep the Germans, just to keep the spies guessing, really. Normal activity. The blokes on the line weren't told until about 48 hours before the attack. You know, really, I mean, this is keeping it right close to your chest. All along the front, there was bombing, sporadic bombing across the front, so no point was sort of, you know, pinned as such. Bombers were flown continuously down the line to mask the sound of the movement of tanks coming into position, armoured personnel carriers coming into position, all these different things coming into position. All unusual movement was occurring at night. And your peer book, when you got notices or your peer book, you had a sign in there saying, keep your mouth shut. Keep your mouth shut to the lads, because there's nothing worse than the lads when they're in a bar in wherever, talking about the next big push. And the attack started at 4:20 a.m. I don't know if anybody likes getting up at 4:20, but I can tell you what, it's the worst time to be attacked. You know, so at 4:20 a.m. that's a really good time to get stuck in there. Yeah. So can you see how effective this is going to be? We also had destiny on our side as well, because there was a light mist that was perfect for the advance of the troops as well. Absolutely perfect. So 700 heavy guns attacked the trenches, hundreds more attacked the artillery behind the line. The aircraft flying over, machine gunned and bombed any enemy activity in there. So as soon as the Germans came out or got into some, they were getting attacked by the aircraft there. And the tanks go in, they've got specific grappling hooks which have been designed to go onto the barbed wire and pull the barbed wire back and just make corridors. And then the other tanks would go through, straight through, and away you go. The whippets would go through there as well, get in to cause havoc. And because there was no artillery to attack the tanks, they were impervious. They could do what they wanted. After the tanks went through, 20,000 cavalry charged through. Men on horses charged through those lines. So cavalry was still being used in 1918. Immensely effective. They could travel really. You even had Canadian troops on bikes taking villages. So they were doing anything to get them from A to B as quickly as possible to keep the momentum up. In terms of the consolidation, they had green line, red line, blue line every 3 miles. Every 3 miles, the front troops, they'd get to the green line, and then they would stop, consolidate, and fresh troops would go through them. Get to the red line, stop, consolidate, fresh troops would come up behind them. It was a rolling movement of brand new, fresh troops, and the Germans were in absolute disarray. The one big thing about Amiens, the real shame of Amiens, was that they weren't as optimistic as they could have been. They stopped. They didn't have the supplies. It only got to 12 miles on the first day, which is just extraordinary on the Western Front. After Amiens, however, the British Army never retreated. Ludendorff, the German commander, called it the blackest day of the German Army's history, which is a good thing. The French commander said that it was the greatest victory of British arms ever. And that's saying something, believe me. That is something to say. And again, it took 12 hours. Now again about Haig, the overall commander of the Western Forces, still French, ordered on the 15th of August, so this is a week later, he ordered Haig to press the attack into what was the Somme areas, the same areas in 1916 where those disasters had occurred. And Haig refused. He refused to follow the orders from the French. He did his own thing. He attacked a weaker point further down the line. The Germans had to reinforce that point, and then a couple of weeks later, he then attacked and followed up on the momentum from Amiens. So there you go. That's not a commander who is melted. All right? This is a commander who knows exactly what he's doing, who is doing his own thing, who is commanding his own forces, and is being incredibly, incredibly successful at it. Well, that's man, great, man. Excellent. Okay? Right, so opinion after the Great War, the vast majority of people thought we'd done a brilliant job and that it was a just war. Right? That's after the First World War. When Haig died, 100,000 people lined up to pay their respects outside his, when he lay in state, beside his coffin. And then we start to see the sort of soul searching after the Great War, after the First World War. Obviously, the poets, a lot of the poets, poetry is very powerful. A lot of the poets have been in the front. Siegfried Sassoon had been immensely brave. But we start to see this sort of reaction, a very negative reaction to the wholesale slaughter of some of the actions. And you can obviously understand that. When Siegfried Sassoon gave his a tirade in 1917, a famous letter to the Times, his comrades were absolutely disgusted that he'd done that. Absolutely disgusted. They were still fighting in France. And then we have this sort of revisionism about what the war was for. 1929 pacifism sort of comes to the fore right across Europe, by the way, which you can obviously understand. I'm not detracting from any of this. What I'm saying is we have to understand the war in its objective context. We tend to see the First World War through the eyes of some of these individuals or some of these perceptions that have accrued since the end of the war. 1933, Hitler was laughing his head off when he heard that the Austrian Union had voted that they would not, under any circumstances, fight for their king or country. Hitler was like, excellent, brilliant, we'll have a bit of that. Okay? Oh, what a lovely war. Again, pacifism, talking about how disgusting it was, a senseless waste of life, anti-imperialism in the 50s and 60s. So we've got all of this baggage that's being put on to what should be a clear understanding of an historical event. We don't have the same baggage associated with the Second World War. And then Marxist Soviet infiltration of academia. This was one of the key objectives of Comintern, or the Soviet Union, to infiltrate. I mean, the unions were horribly infiltrated in the 1960s and 70s, but what academia was as well. So you've got that message being put in there over and over and over again. And you read some of the school books today and you think, well, you're actually asked who started the war. And what's interesting here, executions for desertion and the frequency of mutinies very often reflects on the quality of command. So in Britain, in the British forces, mutinies were almost unheard of on the front. The French, wholesale mutiny, the Russians, the whole lot went, and even the Germans mutinied in 1918. Okay? Imperial forces, again, the numbers are staggering. 420,000 volunteers from Australia, all voluntary. It's just staggering, yeah, from a small population. The biggest voluntary army in the world ever was from Imperial India. The Indians volunteered, over 1 million Indians volunteered. When I say Indians, I'm talking about Pakistan and India, Bangladesh as well, the old India. Volunteered to fight for the British forces. And they also volunteered to fight against their fellow Muslims, lots of the ones from modern Pakistan, against their fellow Muslims in the Middle East, against the Turks. They would rather have fought for the British Empire than the fellow Muslims in the Ottoman Empire. 1 million soldiers from the Indian subcontinent. 140,000 Irishmen volunteered. This is when, 1916, when the Irish, well, the IRA, there was only about 4,000 of them in the IRA, kicked off in the Easter Rising. So while we're having practically a civil war in Ireland, 140,000, well, 200,000 actually fought, but 140,000 volunteered during the war. And there was 620,000 Canadians. It's just unbelievable. So, I'll just finish off. Just put these on there. These are some of the legacy. I suppose the legacy. We've got the push for self-determination and a new sort of way of thinking about the empire, possibly. Homes for heroes. That was one of the outcomes. Build homes for these people coming back who sacrificed everything. Votes for women, it was already building, but certainly this push, because more women were in munitions and doing lots of jobs that had been previously taken by men in the home front. The League of Nations, set up primarily, really, by the British, again, which again was a positive thing. 10-year rule, no war for 10 years, that was what the British decided. We will have no more wars for 10 years. Breakup of the Ottoman Empire. Communism obviously is a negative here, by the way. So communism, the Soviet Union, horrific regime, possibly one of the worst regimes ever to exist. The United States is a world power which starts to detract from the British Empire. Medical, technological advances, and the Germans lost. Okay, so thank goodness for that. They lost the first half of a protracted conflict. Think of the First World War as the first half of a bigger conflict, because we obviously have to come back and do it all again 6 times as worse. 6 times the casualties in the Second World War would be better. I watched Richard Holmes, one of the most famous British historians, fantastic historian, here in this lecture theatre, say that it was such a tragedy that the British didn't push on after the 11th of November and absolutely crush the German forces in 1918, rather than signing the Armistice. The fact that there was a foreign soldier on German soil on the 11th of November 1918 was one of the biggest factors that led to the Second World War. Right? The German sort of war guilt clause and all of that, and we didn't lose, it was a draw and all of that rubbish. Okay? Thank you very much. Is there any questions quickly, or?